I've been down on my luck plenty of times, and I've learned never to look down on people. I've been the guy on the side of the road with my thumb sticking out as cars drove on by. That's why I decided to stop that night, because I knew how he must be feeling. I really wish I hadn't. I was on my way home from Harrisburg, heading back to Philly. I know most of the state like the back of my hand, having spent a few years as a short-range delivery driver. So when I hit the stalled traffic caused by all the road work, I knew what back streets and alternate routes I could turn to. It was one of these lesser-traveled roads that I encountered man slowly walking down the shoulder, thumb hung lazily in the air. At first, I drove past him. Despite what I said about the looking down on people thing, I was a little bit hesitant to let somebody in my car right then. There really wasn't a whole lot around, and I couldn't imagine he was heading to or coming from anything good. But the angel on my shoulder won the battle, and after about a mile I made a U-turn and pulled up alongside him. I could see through my rolled-down window that he was a middle-aged guy, clean-shaven with short-cropped brown hair. He was wearing jeans and a denim jacket, and had a thick rucksack flung over one shoulder. He was holding something small and flat in the crook of his elbow, but I couldn't make out what it was. He seemed alarmed when I first pulled up. I guess he wasn't really expecting anyone to pick him up from the side of the road. I introduced myself through the window and let him know which direction I was headed, and told him he could ride with me for a while if he wanted to. He hesitated at first, but quickly decided that it beat walking alone on a dark road in the dead of night. He opened the door and climbed in. He introduced himself as Ken, and Ken smelled absolutely wretched. I wasn't sure how long he had been on the road and knew that a few days without a shower can really do a number on anyone. Not wanting to make him feel self-conscious, I just kept the windows rolled down and made some small talk. He didn't really go into details on where he was going. He said that he had family in the Northeast and that he had set out a few days ago to make the trek. I had known plenty of guys with hobo-ish tendencies and even had some myself. Despite all the urban legends, they usually weren't a bad sort. Some were even a good time to be around. They just kind of lacked guidance and ambition, and talking to Ken, it seemed like he fell short on both. After maybe a half hour of driving down the nearly deserted road, I asked him about the thing he was carrying. He had placed it on his lap and was covering it with his hands. He became uneasy, so I dropped it. At one point, I thought I caught a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror. Not a light, but rather a dark shape right behind the car. I asked Ken if he saw it. He said no, but when I peeked over at him, I could see that some of the color had drained from his face. I didn't see it again, and we continued on in silence until a short while later when I had to answer nature's call. I pulled over to the side of the road and told Kent that I would be right back. He was a nice enough guy, but I took the keys with me anyway. When I went to get out of the car, Ken grabbed me by the arm and asked me to please not take long. He wasn't rough, but something in his voice struck me as odd. It sounded like fear, almost panic even. I assured him I would be quick and walked about 30 yards away up to the tree line. I had just started to do my thing when out of the corner of my eye I saw something darting from the wood line towards my car. Whatever it was moving fast. 2 more formless shadows followed it an instant later, then another one on my left. This all happened in the span of 2 seconds, and before I could zip up and turn around, I heard a scream from behind me coming from my car. I spun around and was caught with a bizarre spectacle. Those darting figures were now running in a full circle around my car. The shadows weren't anything material, and in fact even seemed to grow and shrink in size and shape. Ken locked eyes with me through the open window, staring at me in dread silence. I had the keys in my pocket, and there was no way for him to roll it up. I was too in awe of what I was seeing to make any kind of rational decision. The forms just kept racing and racing around my car, a blur of erratic black shapes. Suddenly, one of the shadows dove in through the window, and Ken started screaming. He had been wearing his seatbelt, and I was close enough to hear his bones shattering as his body was forced through upper part of the mechanism. The blurred form seemed to have Ken by the legs and started dragging him across the road. All of the other shapes now converged with the one carrying Ken. The thing underwent some kind of sick transformation, taking on the full mass of all the combined shadows. The end result was a massive creature, possibly 12 feet tall if not more. It had defined legs and arms now, one hand wrapped around Ken's legs. The head seemed to be in the shape of a bull, immense rack of antlers crowning its head. The beast moved quickly into the forest on the far side of the road. I could hear Ken's screams for some time before they faded away. I was trying to contain my terror. I realized that my entire body was shaking so violently that I cracked a tooth. I stumbled over to my car, resting against the passenger side door and trying to decipher what the hell had just happened. I happened to be looking down through the open window, and on the floor beneath where Ken had been sitting was a book. There were strange symbols on the cover, one I recognized as a pentagram. I flipped through the book and felt bile start to rise in my throat. I couldn't understand any of the writing. It was in a language I had never seen before, and it certainly wasn't Latin. The sickening part was that the ink appeared to be dried blood in some parts. Other parts actually seemed to have been written with human fecal matter. I dropped the book to the ground and ran around to my driver's side door. Before I got in, though, I caught sight of Ken's rucksack sitting in the back seat. With trepidation, I removed it and untied the flap. The bag was filled with the remains of, well, I don't know what. There were bones with meat and flesh still attached, and while I tried to tell myself none of it was human, a part of me knew that it was. I threw the bag out onto the grass as far as I could, got in my car, and drove full speed down the road, not looking back once. I never went to the police. What was I going to tell them? I pitched up a hitchhiker, and Demon carried him off into the woods, and I threw out his bag of human remains. That was probably an easy way to end up on a watch list somewhere. No, I didn't do anything at all. Ken, or whoever he was obviously mixed up in some kind of dark and evil affair, one which I wanted no part of. Whatever it was that night, it left me well enough alone, and I plan on keeping it that way. I'm only telling this story so it can serve as a warning. Be careful who you stop for when driving down dark and lonely roads. You know when you have those really dumb ideas to do something that you probably shouldn't? Well, I guess I didn't realize scenarios like this existed until we did what we did. One night, when I was younger, me and a couple of my friends went to this local area known for being, let's just say, scary. There were many urban legends about the place, and lots of people talked about it. But no one, at least none that we knew of, had ever gone. So, being the geniuses we were, we went to see how true the stories were. There were about 5 of us in total. Some of us brought our partners, and we thought it would be like a fun adventure. But like a plot in a horror movie, it was very much the opposite. The location was on a dirt road near an old farmhouse. We probably should have seen the warning signs, but we clearly didn't. Anyways, we were driving along this dirt path. All the while, we are having silly conversations about God knows what, when suddenly someone in the car says, "Do you all see that?" We all looked, of course, and we didn't see anything. "No," they said, "not on the road, on the corn." All along the sides of this dirt path were long, thick rows of corn. They were very tall, so it was hard to see the tops of them from the car. I'm looking out the window, and I'm concentrating real hard on the corn. But we were driving by it so quickly I couldn't really see much. I suppose I could have asked the driver to stop, but I didn't because I didn't see anything. I could tell the other person in the car was getting irritated that we weren't acknowledging the things they had seen. They started to panic a bit and asked the driver to turn around. The driver explains that we hadn't even made it to the area and that we shouldn't be freaked out yet, that it was in their head that something was wrong. Oddly, as this bickering is happening, there's several banging noises from the roof of the car. It didn't sound like knocking. It sounded more like several things were hitting and dragging against the top of the car as it passed by. So, the driver stops. We all get out of the car, and we notice there's a tree a couple feet behind the car. I automatically think that some branches just scratched up the roof of the car, but the strange thing was, there were a bunch of long things hanging off one of the tree's branches. Again, we were geniuses, so we go to see what was in the tree. And I kid you not, there were cow legs freshly severed dangling from the tree branches. The person who had seen something prior began repeating loudly, "I told you! I told you!" It was like they were in shock because they weren't saying anything else. I asked, "What did you tell us? You didn't say anything." This must have sparked something in them because they defensively stated, "I told you to look at the corn." I now realized that I was in the perfect position to see the corn. So I look. Sure enough, along the tops of the corn stalks were red splotches. Clearly, it was blood. The driver says, "This is what we came for. Let's get in the car and see if we can find the farmhouse." I'm not going to lie. I was one of the few people that wanted to keep going. I suppose it was mostly just me and the driver. Everyone else wanted to leave. But the driver was a very stubborn person. So we all got back in the car. I suppose everyone thought it would be better than standing alone on a dirt road with severed cow legs. The mood in the car is obviously very different. No one is talking. All we can hear are the tires on the dirt. Well, that was until we heard the corn stalks bending and breaking. And then the strange cow noises started to pick up. Yeah. Something was moving in the cornfield, and it sounded like cows were being scared or tortured or both. So the panicking started up again. A few of the passengers were pleading to go home. It must have worked because eventually the driver decides that finding the farmhouse was no longer necessary. So we turn around and head back down that same dirt path. The corn stalks on both sides of the car seem to have more and more blood on them as we get closer to the entrance of the dirt path. I can't help but to look out the window at it all. It didn't seem real. So I guess in my mind, if I stared at it long enough, I might understand what was happening. There's a sudden stop. Most of us fly forward abruptly because none of us were wearing seatbelts. We really didn't bother with them in those days. Like I said, we were geniuses. One of the passengers starts screaming at the top of their lungs and pointing their finger out towards the front of the car. I couldn't see in the back seat, so I shuffled around and saw that in the middle of the path was a severed cow's head. We race out of there like bats out of hell. And to be honest, I haven't to this day come to terms with what all happened that night. There were talks that things like that happened on that road, but none of us, not a single one of us, actually believed it to be true. In many ways, I think about if it might be our fault that those poor animals were brutalized. Maybe us being there was a reason to create a show. All I know is I don't forgive myself. And I still don't really know what all went on that farmland. I'm married, so sometimes my spouse and I will visit their home state. They are mourning the loss of their parents, and it just relieves them to see a familiar place. We go often, at least twice a year. They love to get a few things from there, stuff you wouldn't be able to get where we live. And sometimes we like to go to the family home and fish in the river out back. We had done our rounds a few weeks ago, and we were on our way home when we saw something that was hard to make sense of. My spouse grew up in a very superstitious culture. I, on the other hand, not so much. I am very much a person of facts and reason. I guess that's what makes my story all the more unusual. We were driving through a part of the state before crossing back into our own. That weekend was so windy that we didn't fish once. I actually brought all the night crawlers back for our grandkids' turtles. Anyways, the wind was wild and it was snowing. We always try to beat the snow this time of year. But I guess that didn't work out either. This part of the state is very flat. So, between the fallen snow and sky, the place was almost entirely white. Now I say almost because there was something else out there. There was something walking upright off in the distance. I thought my eyes were fooling me, but my spouse must have seen it too because they stopped talking. It was tall and thin and dark. And as we got closer to the entity, I'm not sure what to call it, I could see clearly that it was wearing a pointed black hat and some type of blue shawl over its shoulders. They were struggling to walk against the wind. I mean, it was blowing hard, and they continued walking through the harshness of it all. I was impressed. But that's when nothing started to make much sense. Who was this person? Why were they walking in the middle of nowhere? And why were they doing it in this type of weather? Now let me make this very clear. This part of the state is desolate. It's flat. It's rural. There's not a sign of civilization for miles. Yet this person, whoever they were, was walking through it as if they were on a mission. I don't know what it could have possibly been, but I wanted to make sure I could identify them as a person. As if anything else was an option. To me, it wasn't, right? My spouse started to get uncomfortable. I could tell. All they kept saying was, "What is that?" I didn't know how to respond. How could I? I couldn't even understand what I was seeing. The questions kept coming. What is that? But I just kept thinking, who is that? My spouse instructed me to keep going so we could get as close of a look as we could. I didn't want to tell them that I had already planned to do so because I was just as curious as they were. If I had, it might have made them more scared, because I'm not usually the type to get curious. As we moved forward through the snow and wind, which, by the way, got louder as we approached the traveler, we were able to get a better look. It was as I saw feet back, a tall, pointed hat, and a blue shawl, but we still couldn't see the face. Something told me I needed to see that face. I had to. There was no other option. I'm not sure why this was so important to me. Seeing the face of something that looked like an insane person traveling through the snow. But I had to. And not long after I thought about this, my spouse uttered, "We have to see their face." We continued to drive, and soon we were close enough to see the face of whoever, whatever this thing was. I looked across my spouse and out through their window on the passenger side. My spouse was looking as well. Chills ran through me. I didn't think I could get much colder, but I did. And the hairs stood up on my arms, neck, and back. As we passed the stranger, we looked out. And as we looked out, the individual looked in. They were looking right at us. The best way I can describe the face of this person, or whatever you want to call it, is that it was all black. I'm not sure if it was painted black or if the person was wearing some type of mask, but their face was completely black. All I could see were the eyes. Those eyes peering back at us. No other features could be seen. Not a nose, not a mouth. This faceless person, whoever they were, was just as interested in us as we were of it. And that is probably the most frightening part of it all. I thought to myself, all right, this person has an unusual mask, but that doesn't make the situation unusual. But my spouse, they were frozen stiff. They weren't speaking. They were hardly moving. So we pass this individual and keep driving. And just as I start to see them in my rearview mirror, I notice that their path changes. They are no longer walking the same way as before. Instead, they began walking behind the car, like they were crossing the road. So I start to wonder, what are they doing? The only reasonable thing that crossed my mind at the time is that maybe they were looking for roadkill. Now, why they were looking for roadkill was a whole different can of worms I did not want to open. But it made the most sense, and I was relatively content with it. But that's when things got more bizarre. The person crosses the road. Both my spouse and myself are watching them. They make it across the road, and in an instant, they vanish. Again, this is flat land, as flat as you can get it, and the terrain is completely white. So where did they go? Who were they? Why was their face black? What were they doing out in the middle of a desert in the snow? I can't answer any of this, and I'm still trying to make sense of it all.